Berthiaume. I'm from Woodward Academy in Atlanta, and I'm here this morning to give you an introduction and background on this year's debate topic, the arms sales topic. It's not going to teach you everything you need to know, that's why you're at debate camp, but the idea is to get you familiar with a number of terms and concepts and give you a little background on the information so that when you're reading evidence starting this afternoon with your lab, you sort of have some context for what we're talking about. For those of you who have already done a bunch of reading on arms sales, there may be a little bit of duplication, but I think that's probably good. It sort of reinforces some things. For those of you who don't know very much about arms sales yet, I think you're going to learn a lot. So, starting with the first section, which is the introduction and background on the topic, the resolution this year is that the United States federal government should substantially reduce direct commercial sales and or foreign military sales of arms from the United States. And the interesting thing about that topic is that it has been chosen nationally, so you all may not know how debate topics are chosen, but the way debate topics are chosen is that pretty much anyone can propose a topic, and then all of the schools in the country that participate in debate get a chance to vote on what you are learning about this year. So the arms sales topic was chosen from a number of other options, and the idea is that it was chosen for you all because people think that you should be learning about arms sales. So why do people think you should be learning about arms sales? Why did we say, out of all the things we could be debating about this year, that we chose to debate arms sales in particular right now, and why do we choose to debate arms sales? So one of the reasons is that arms sales have become increasingly controversial. You will notice when you start researching this topic and when you start learning more about the topic, there are lots of things that are happening right now about arms sales. It is not sort of something that happens once in a while. It is an ongoing process. There have been many arms deals already this year. Many of them have been highly controversial, and it is something that is becoming increasingly controversial over time. Another reason why we're debating arms sales is that the United States is the biggest seller. So when we're talking about arms sales, there's a reason we're talking about it from the perspective of the United States, and that reason is because the United States is by far the biggest seller of arms at this point, and I'll show you a chart on that later. And then finally, another reason that I think we're debating arms sales right now is that it is truly an international topic. So sometimes when we have international debate topics, we debate a single country. So a few of you might have been around when we debated the China topic. A couple of years ago, we debated about China. We spent one whole year debating about China. This topic is not like that. This topic, we are actually going to be debating about a lot of different countries. And so it is an international topic where you will be learning about dozens of different countries across the globe, not just a single area. And so I think another just sort of ancillary benefit about debating about arms sales is you're going to learn a lot about foreign policy for different parts of the world, not just a single part of the world. So what are we talking about here? What is this topic? What is the arms sales topic? I would sort of say that although we call it the arms sales topic, like if your parents were like, what are you debating about this year? You'd probably say arms sales, right? That's what I certainly have said when people at school have asked, what's the debate topic next year? But I think this is really the foreign military sales and direct commercial sales topic. And it's really important to understand what those words mean, because those are sort of the words in the resolution that will help you determine what we're going to be debating about and what the affirmative is going to propose. So the most important terms to understand, and if you get nothing else out of this, hopefully by the end, you'll sort of understand what foreign military sales and direct commercial sales are. So, foreign military sales. A foreign military sale is a direct sale of U.S. equipment to another country's military. So when the United States government sells material to another country, and we do so from our government to their government. This is administered by the Department of Defense, and where we get the weapons is generally out of DoD surplus stocks or will establish a specific contract. But this is a government-to-government interaction. On the other hand, the other type of sale that is topical, the direct commercial sale, is a sale from an arms manufacturer to another country. So that one is not the United States government gets together with another government and agrees to sell. That is a company, a business in the United States would like to sell some type of weapon system. We'll talk about what those might mean in just a second. They want to sell something from a United States arms manufacturer to someone in another country. And that is something that has to be authorized by the U.S. government. That wasn't always true. If you were talking arms sales like before World War I, they basically didn't happen. But when they did, it was just like anyone could sell anything. Now, those are regulated by governments. And so in order to sell certain types of weapons from the United States to another country, from a company in the United States to another country, they have to get something called an export license, which is a license that says it's okay for you to sell this. And the reason, unsurprisingly, is because we don't want, the United States doesn't want our companies selling sensitive technology willy-nilly all over the world, so the government has to authorize that sale. It's not the same. So like, if Apple wants to sell iPods in another country, or they want to sell the iPad in another country, they can do that probably without an export license because it doesn't require, it's not a weapon, right? But when you're talking about selling weapons, there is a higher level of scrutiny, and that requires an export license. The word arms, you will notice, is also in the topic. So when you're looking at the topic, the United States federal government should substantially reduce direct commercial sales and/or foreign military sales of arms from the United States. And one thing that's sort of an interesting question is whether the word of arms further limits what we're talking about, or whether arms is just sort of a not necessary word. Like, does direct commercial sales and foreign military sales, those words have meaning, right? Those terms have meaning. But does adding of arms make the topic smaller or not? That is an open debate. I am guessing that you will have several topicality debates this year on it. But if we're talking about what arms means, and you want to know sort of just like, what are we talking about? What's an arms? We're probably talking about things like weapons systems, or we are talking about things like weapon systems. That includes things like aircrafts. It includes armor and artillery. It includes things like guidance and radar systems. It includes missiles. And includes warships. Okay, so we're talking, for the most part, we're talking about big stuff. Okay, large pieces of equipment that we are selling from the United States to other countries. Some definitions of arms also included smaller weapons. They're called small arms, like guns and that sort of thing, and ammunition, but it depends on the definition. So that will be something that you'll get to debate about this year, potentially, if an affirmative is talking about non-large weapons systems. They're talking about individual pieces of artillery. There are also some things that we do with other countries' militaries that are probably not foreign military sales or direct commercial sales. And I think it's important to sort of understand that. If, for example, the United States is sending troops into that country, that is not a foreign military sale or direct commercial sale. It's not an arms sale, even if those people come with their arms, right? Like the United States, if we invade a country, when we invaded Iraq, we brought tanks with us. That was not an arms sale. That was the United States invading. There are also other forms of military assistance that are probably not FMS or DCS. Things like training other people's militaries and joint exercises with those militaries are probably not FMS or DCS. Right after 9/11, we started to establish training programs where we directly train other countries' militaries in counterterrorism missions. And that often included an arms sale as a component of it, but probably training their military is not included in FMS or DCS. We also do things like in-air refueling, where we fly a plane over and put it on top of another plane and refuel that plane. We do that a lot for Saudi Arabia. That is probably not FMS or DCS. And then we also do things like locating bases in the country. So some of the countries we're going to be talking about that we do arms sales to, we also have a military base there, like Bahrain or Qatar. That is probably not topical to reduce those things. Those are things that might go with an arms sale, but they're probably not the arms sale itself. So it is probably not part of the topic to eliminate those things. And so when you're looking at proposals for what we should do in a particular area of the world, some of those proposals will suggest eliminating arms sales, but they'll also suggest doing a bunch of other things. Those other things might not be something that you're allowed to do. All right, let's talk about current global arms sales. So how much are we talking about when we're talking about current global arms sales? There's a chart for this if you're looking at the charts, and that chart sort of shows you the trend in international transfers of major weapons, and the chart that I provided is 1979 to 2018. It's a little graph, and you will see that the line sort of goes up and down. I am guessing that you could predict or you can see major world events if you're looking at that graph. But the idea is that there is a very large amount of arms sales. There are billions and billions of dollars of arms sales every year. and that since 9/11 it is mostly gone up. There's some little dips. You can see the 2008 economic crisis on there. Some countries stopped buying weapons for a little bit, but the idea is that we are increasing over time for the most part, although down from the Cold War. So, who are the sellers? I told you that the United States is the biggest seller. I didn't tell you that the United States over the last decade is about 34% of the total. You'll see numbers between like 32 and 35%. Depends a little bit on how you count. But right around 34% of all arms are sold from the United States. So the United States is an enormous seller when we're looking at arms sales. The next countries that also sell arms drops off pretty quickly from there. We have Russia in second place with about 21%. They're right around 21%. Then following there, we got France, Germany, China, and the United Kingdom. And they're all sort of between 4 and 7%. It varies a little bit year to year. If you're looking at the last 5 years-ish, you would see them in the order of France, Germany, China, UK. But over the last 10 years or 15 years, that's varied a little bit. But the group that we're talking about here is sort of the US, Russia, France, Germany, China, the United Kingdom. And then there's another group of countries that also sell arms, but on a much smaller basis. You will notice that most of those countries, 5 of those 6 countries are the permanent UN Security Council members. I don't think that's a coincidence that the sort of heavy hitters in the UN are also the people dealing the arms. And for your reference, about 80% of the international trade in arms comes from those 6 sources. So there are those 6 sources that I just named. About 80% of the trade comes from those 6 sources. All right, so who's buying? We know who's selling, who's buying. If you look at the countries that are the biggest arms importers, you will see that over the last 10 years, India has been by far the largest with the most defense imports. They are followed by relatively closely by Saudi Arabia, and then China, Australia, Algeria, and then they sort of fall off from there. But if you're talking in just raw numbers, India is definitely number 1, followed by Saudi Arabia, and then China. China's an interesting case, right? Because I said they were also one of the top arms exporters, right? China is there's the only country that is both a top importer and a top exporter. And the reason for that is because they're importing and exporting different things. They are importing a lot of high-level aerospace and that sort of thing, information technology, spying kinds of things, and they are exporting more lower-level artillery kinds of things. But they are doing both, and so that's sort of an interesting thing about China. So the United States as an arms dealer, when we're talking about the topic, we're talking about where the United States is selling arms. And one thing that's really important to understand is that the United States sells arms to an enormous number of countries. An enormous number of countries. I would underline that. In 2017, we sent arms to 98 countries. Okay, just that one year, 98 countries. Anyone know how many countries there are in the world? You got a guess? Yeah. Say what?
151.
There's more than that. Yeah.
196.
Oh, that's very good. Mine says 195. There's like a couple of disputed, like, are they countries or are they not? Yeah, no, I'm with you. In 2017, in that one year, we sent arms to just over half of the world. Okay? Just over half of the countries in the world got something from the United States in 2017. Since 2002, which is when we ratcheted up the sort of arms sales, then we have sold to 167 countries in the world. 85% of the world has received an arms sale from the United States. And that was something I just didn't super understand when I started researching this topic. I was thinking, I know the big ones, right? I know which countries we sell to a lot. I didn't understand that we sell to a lot of different countries. And that's going to be something to keep in mind, both in terms of how we can limit this topic, and it's something just to understand when you're thinking about the topic. This is a global issue, not just a few countries' issue. However, there are some countries that get a lot of stuff from us. So if you're looking at 2009 to 2018, 10 years, the 10 year that we have data on, Saudi Arabia is by far the number 1 of getting arms from the United States. So who are we selling to? Number 1 was Saudi Arabia. Number 2, does anybody know? Got a guess?
Israel.
Those are good guesses.
Egypt. Taiwan.
Also a good guess.
Australia.
Australia, you're looking at a picture, I like it. This is just whatever, you gave me a chart, I'm going to look at the chart. Yes, Australia is number 2, followed by the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, followed by South Korea, and then Iraq, and then Singapore, and then Turkey, and then Japan, and then Taiwan, and then the United Kingdom. So that is an interesting list, right? It is a list of a bunch of different types of countries and countries that we have a bunch of different relationships with. And when we start talking in just a couple minutes about how affirmatives are likely to set up the affirmatives and like what different types of affirmatives we're likely to see on this topic, it's important to keep in mind that those, these countries we have different kinds of relationships with, and we'll sort of look at how that works. But that is to whom we are sending money. All right. So we're going to do a little bit of history here, a brief history of arms sales. And if you are looking at the chart, there is, and if you are not looking at the deck, it's totally fine. Just look at this later. But there is an interesting little video. Video is not really the right word. It's like an interactive map, okay, that shows how the United States' arms sales have changed over time and where we're sending our arms sales to. But that's something you can look at later. Right now, I want to talk about sort of the major trends. So over the last 100 years, I would say that there have been sort of 4 major trends in arms sales globally. Okay, 4 major trends. Number 1 is increasing government control over sales. I told you that before World War I and really almost up to World War II, countries could sell arms and companies could sell arms, and they could do so without needing any export licenses. It was just sort of negotiated between governments or negotiated between companies, and you would just sort of sell things. Over the last 100 years, and we're going to look at those laws in just a second in the United States, but across the world, countries have been increasing government control over sales. They don't want their companies just selling to anyone. They want to have a little bit more control over that. The second thing that is a major trend is a dramatic increase in volume. So there have been some ups and downs. The end of the Cold War, which we'll talk about in a second, caused a very dramatic decrease and almost an immediate decrease in arms sales. But overall, the volume of arms sales has increased from basically 0 100 years ago, or very, very low, to what it is now. A third thing to understand is that there is an increasing diversity of suppliers. So for the first years of arms sales during the Cold War, the main countries that sold weapons were the U.S. and the USSR. Just those 2 countries accounted for almost 80% of sales, sometimes even 80% of sales. A distant third seller was the United Kingdom, who was allied with the United States. But other countries were not really selling arms at that point. China was not even really on the scene as an arms seller until 1971, but now they're in the top 5. Another thing that has happened, in addition to an increasing diversity of suppliers, is among countries like the United States and China and the UK and Germany and France, is an increase in third world secondary suppliers. So what they mean by that is that countries who buy weapons also are selling them. They're either reselling them or they've started their own production of maybe different types of things than they're buying. And so the number of countries, like the sheer portion of the world that sells arms in some capacity, has dramatically increased over the last 100 years. And then the final major trend is an increasing diversity of recipients. So initial arms sales were to other major powers. So it was like the United States selling to other NATO countries who had their own militaries, who had very developed weapon systems themselves. They might also be producing weapons, but the United States would also sell within NATO. By the 1970s, other countries and other areas of the world had started getting in on the arms sales buying game, including the Middle East, Southeast Asia, Africa, Latin America, and you'll sort of see that the number of countries that buy weapons has increased over time. Since the 1970s, the Middle East gets the largest share of sales. If you're looking at sort of who the buyers are, if you sort of add up that region of the world, it is overwhelmingly the largest area of the world that's getting sales. It's also a lot of times it's connected to oil availability and prices. Those countries, when oil is doing well, have a lot of ability to buy things, and a lot of the things that they buy are weapons. And then it's also connected to, unsurprisingly, the number of military interventions that have happened in that area of the world since the Cold War. So we're talking the 1991 Gulf War, we're talking the War on Terror, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen. All of that area of the world has had a lot of military interventions, which then leads to a lot of arms sales. So, looking at the periods of time, let's talk about the Cold War a little bit. During the Cold War, the United States and the USSR were selling to their allies lots of arms sales we're doing them, for the most part, to try to avoid military intervention. And so the idea is that instead of sending troops like we did, in World War II and like we did in Korea and Vietnam and that sort of thing, there were some circumstances where instead we could have what's called a proxy conflict. And a proxy conflict, which are mostly in the Middle East and Latin America, some other areas of the world as well, is where instead of the United States directly getting involved and the USSR directly getting involved, right, then it's a hot war, we have proxy conflicts where the United States is arming one side of a conflict, the USSR was arming another side of a conflict, and so we were not actually fighting Soviet troops, but our proxies were fighting their proxies in a whole different, a ton of areas of the world. And that's when arms sales really became a thing. One interesting thing to note is that during this period of time, the US and the USSR, and to a lesser extent France, were really into just sort of giving weapons away. They would do them on really favorable credit programs. There were a bunch of loans, but there were no interest loans, and then maybe that loan would get forgiven. So a lot of times when you were talking arms sales during the Cold War, yes, they are selling them, but they're selling them at much less than the value of those weapons, because really they were interested in the proxy, not the making money, okay? So sometimes arms sales is about money, sometimes arms sales is about the conflict. In this case, it was about the conflict. Another thing to know is that the USSR sold more than the United States throughout the Cold War. So they were even more involved in arms sales than the United States was. In 1969, President Nixon established the Nixon Doctrine, and that established an official policy that the United States would give military and economic support to regimes that were friendly to us. And that was the first time arms sales had been made an official part of our foreign policy. So now it's not just like we sometimes sell arms to people and we'll look at that on a case-by-case basis. Now an official part of our foreign policy is arms sales. And that was, again, connected to the idea that if we could send arms, we maybe wouldn't have to send troops. All right, so the end of the Cold War. The end of the Cold War happens. And there is a reduction in sales. So the end of the superpower proxy conflicts led to a dramatic decrease in arms sales. Also, as it turns out, armies had a lot of stuff from the Cold War they didn't need more, right? If you're getting a ton of arms sales, they were at a point where it was just like, we're stocked up, we're good, we don't need anything more. One thing that I didn't know until I started reading more about individual weapon systems is that a lot of the things that we sell in arms sales can be used for a really, really long time, okay? And so when we do an arms sale, we're not talking about just like, what are they going to use this year, what's useful for this year, how long. We're really having to project pretty far into the future because those weapons can continue to be used, the artillery can continue to be used, the armor is useful, the tanks are useful, the planes are useful, quite far into the future. And so at the end of the Cold War, people didn't need to buy more stuff because they had lots from the Cold War time. Also at the end of the Cold War, the United States became the dominant exporter. It shifted from bipolar US and USSR arms sales to pretty much unipolar arms sales for quite a while. So you don't necessarily need to write this down, but in 1989, the United States was 22% and the USSR was 35%. Remember I said they sold more than the United States. So right at the end of the Cold War, 22%, 35%. By 1994, just 5 years later, okay, Russia, USSR became Russia, is now only 3% of sales. Okay, so they went from being 35% of sales in 1989 to 5 years later being only 3% of sales. They have since rebounded, and a lot of that is economics. When Russia had an economic issue in the late 90s, they jump-started their economy by increasing arms sales, and that's how that happened. Another thing that's sort of important to understand about the end of the Cold War time is that there was a pretty big shift in how conflict is conducted worldwide between interstate conflicts between states, one government to a different government in another country, to intrastate conflicts. So a lot of the conflicts that arms sales are involved in now are not between government X and government Y. They're between a group in country Y and a different group, maybe the government in country Y. And that has changed, sort of how we sell arms. The final thing that you should know about sort of the end of the Cold War period, and this carries through to the present day, is that there was a pretty big shift between selling arms for ideology to selling arms for profit. And the idea there is that the United States sort of started to see arms sales as a part of an economic strategy in addition to a military strategy. And we had moved away from sort of the capitalism versus communism fights of the US versus the USSR. And as a result, we often started to arm both sides of a conflict. So Greece and Turkey they don't get along, we provide arms sales to both countries. Armenia and Azerbaijan, we provided arms to both sides of those conflicts when they were in conflict. So it became less, we're going to arm this country to defeat another country we definitely want defeated, and more sort of a part of our foreign policy and a part of our economic policy. One reason for that is that the defense industry has become a lot stronger over time and has been pushing for more sales. One thing that you need to know about the defense industry is that they are extremely politically active, and we'll look at a chart about the contractors in a second. But they are extremely, extremely politically active, and they are extremely, extremely powerful in American politics. One way they do this, and when you start to research individual arms sales, you're going to see this, and it's really interesting, is that they try to spread out the benefit of an arms sale or of a particular defense system as broadly as possible geographically in the United States. So instead of just producing a weapon system in one location in the United States, where only that district and thus that congressperson would have an interest in the jobs in that area, the defense industry's strategy is to spread that extremely broadly. So an individual weapon or a weapon system will be produced in a number of places in the United States, thus giving more congresspeople that same incentive to support that deal. And that strategy became very much more active at the end of the Cold War. The last thing in that section is that in 1995, President Clinton passed Presidential Decision Directive 34, Presidential Decision Directive 34, and that explicitly added the effects on U.S. defense industry and the effects on U.S. jobs to the list of things we consider when contemplating an arms sale. So prior to 1995, we might have taken that into account, but it wasn't an explicit criterion, right? We're just looking at security, we're looking at the effect of the arms sales on stability, on conflict. After 1995, explicitly, does this arms sale help the United States economy? Does it create jobs in the United States? Does it help our defense industrial base? Became an explicit part of that decision. And that has also increased the amount to which selling for profit becomes an important thing now. All right, 1991, we get the Gulf War. Going back just a little bit. 1991 Gulf War. The results of the 1991 Gulf War, there were two sort of important things that happened vis-a-vis arms sales. One is that there was a global effort to control arms trade. So one of the things that happened when the United States got involved in the Iraq-Kuwait conflict in 1991 is that the United States and really the global community was extremely surprised by the quantity and quality of weapons that the Saddam Hussein administration had. Okay, we got surprised, and the reason that we were surprised, and so were almost everyone, is that he was covertly buying weapons from multiple sources. So he was making deals with a number of different countries under the table, under the radar, and so one country selling to Iraq saw that deal only in the context of, okay, we're fine with Iraq having this amount of weapons, but they were not seen in the context of he's also making this deal and this deal and this deal. And so there became right after that a sort of global effort to sort of at least make some of these decisions a little bit more above board. People were very concerned. They did not want that to happen again. On the flip side, the result of the Gulf War also reinvigorated arms sales. So arms sales had declined at the end of the Cold War. 1991 did have a little blip to reinvigorate arms sales, at least in the Middle East region. And that's when it sort of started to shift toward mostly arms sales to the Middle East. And the reason for that is because other countries in the Middle East wanted to defend against future Iraqi aggression. They had sort of seen a country be aggressive. Iraq invaded Kuwait, and they were like, ooh, better have some arms sales to make sure that that does not happen to us. And so that was when they were sort of reinvigorating that situation. The United States had an interest there as well. The United States wanted new and stronger Middle East allies in case Iraq was to become aggressive again. So the United States was very interested in making a bunch of these arms sales, and when we look at Saudi Arabia later, that's a country that we've continued to sell to, in part as starting after the Gulf War because we wanted new and stronger allies in that region. All right, after 9/11 happens, there's sort of two major things that happen. The first one is there is a dramatic increase in United States exports. The United States determined that we were going to need some more strategic partners to fight the war on terror, to help us out in Afghanistan, to help us out in Iraq. And so we started dramatically increasing arms sales to those regions of the world that we thought could help us in the war on terror. India and Pakistan were particular beneficiaries immediately after 9/11 of new arms sales. But we also started to do more joint ventures with foreign companies. So a United States company and a foreign company get together and together create a weapon system. And the idea there was that then when our troops are fighting in the war on terror alongside those troops, the weapons would be interoperable. That's a word that you should know. Interoperability means can these things work with these other things? And our idea was if we are the ones producing and selling the weapons, and if we're doing joint ventures with other countries that we are working with on the war on terror, then when we go into the field, all of our stuff works together, okay? The one thing that happened as a result of the dramatic increase in U.S. exports is that there was a substantial reduction in our assessments of human rights and other elements of security. We were very, very focused on can this country help us on the war on terror, and much, much, much less focused than we had been in the past on, is this a country that does human rights abuses? Is this a weak or potentially future failing state? Like, is this government stable? There was a lot of is this a strategic country to sell to in the context of the war on terror, and a very large reduction in other concerns, which has had some effects that we'll see later on. The second thing that happened post 9/11 is that there's a bunch of new countries that that started selling weapons. So we talked earlier about the major trend being increasing in diversity. A lot of this happened post 9/11. Russia started selling a lot again. Remember, they were only 3% in 1994. Now they started ratcheting up back to where they sort of are now. And then China became a major importer and exporter. So that was when China sort of started to get much more involved. Finally, sort of what's happening under the Trump administration. An important thing to contextualize is that all of the things that Trump is doing in arms sales are really just continuations of previous trends, okay? So I'm going to describe sort of in a second about what is happening under the Trump administration, but it's important to understand that that's not like a total break with previous policy. There are some things on which the Trump administration is like a very large departure from Obama. If we're talking about like the EPA or whatever, then there's a big difference in how the two presidents are dealing with the issue. With arms sales, Trump is more in all of the categories, but he's not totally different. And so that's an important thing to understand. So Trump, even more arms sales, okay? It is that we are on a record pace on arms sales, selling more than we have any time in your lifetimes for sure. We are also even more focused on economics rather than human rights considerations. And even more focused on economics, even sometimes than security situations. So Trump, you know that he considers himself to be a business person. He's like real into his businessman identity. There is very much an element, and if you watch him announcing one of these arms sales, I think you will see this just sort of in his demeanor. There's very much an element where he sees arms sales as like making a deal, right? Like selling Trump Tower or whatever. He is seeing it as a real estate deal, except instead of real estate, it's arms sales, okay? So he is very, very interested in describing these arms sales as economically beneficial to the United States. Another reason for that, of course, is that, politically, the economic considerations are very important to American people. For the most part, American people don't love arms sales that much, right? Like the idea of giving weapons to another country, I think most people, if you were to start to talk to your parents, would be like, how do you feel about us giving 100 weapons to more than 100 countries? I don't think they're going to be like, that's awesome. But the way Trump describes it, and the way it is often described in the literature, is sort of a business deal that creates jobs. If you describe it as like, how do you feel about a new factory opening in your region that creates a lot of jobs, a lot of good-paying jobs for the people there, all of a sudden people start to get more in on that. And so he has definitely emphasized the economics of the situation. Another thing to know is that for the most part, Obama sold aircraft. He was very that sort of element in things, and Trump has been mostly missiles and bombs, and some of that is just because of what countries are requesting right now. All right, let's talk about existing regulations on arms sales. So to understand how an arms sale works, I think it is useful to sort of know how it's supposed to work, and then it's useful to sort of see how it sometimes does work in practice. So the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961, the FAA, not the Federal Aviation Administration, but the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961 was the first law that established processes and procedures for foreign aid, which included military aid. So processes and procedures for foreign aid, including military aid. 15 years later, in 1976, Congress passed the Arms Export Control Act. The Arms Export Control Act, the AECA. And that amended and modified the Foreign Assistance Act and was the first act that is specifically about arms sales. So the Foreign Assistance Act included all types of military aid and foreign aid. This is specific to arms sales. And it combined direct commercial sales and foreign military sale regulations under one act. So this is the controlling act for FMS and DCS. And it's congressional legislation, meaning Congress passed it. But in the Congress's legislation, they established executive branch authority over arms deals. So they said, look, we, Congress, are saying the executive gets to have authority over arms deals. That authority is split between the State Department and the Department of Defense. But we're going to still require two things of the executive. Actually, three things of the executive. We're going to require three things of the executive. We're going to first require a risk assessment. So each deal that is done between the United States and another country, whether it is an FMS or DCS, requires a risk assessment to evaluate the benefits and potential negative consequences of that deal. Okay, so you gotta do a risk assessment. You can't just you don't have free rein. Second, large arms sales require the executive to notify Congress in advance. So there's a congressional notification process. And finally, Congress reserved for itself congressional authority to fully block an arms deal. Okay, they reserved their authority to be like, we get to say no to this. However, since the AECA was established in 1976, Congress has never fully blocked an arms deal. There are some other things that you will see that individual Congresspeople have done to sort of prevent or change or modify what the administrations were looking to do. But they have never said just like, you want this deal, we veto. No. As a result, that means that the risk assessment is much more cursory, right? It's much lower level than it would have to be if the administrations thought that there was a chance that Congress was going to block it, right? If every deal required, for example, Congress to approve the deal rather than to block the deal, that would be a very different process for arms sales. But it's not like that. It is not that Congress has to say yes to every arms sale. It is that they have the ability to say no, which they have not done. There is an infographic that I think it is worth looking at later about the most recent emergency arms sale to Saudi Arabia. Does anybody know anything about what's going on there? Yeah, what do you got?
Congress tried to stop the Trump administration from selling weapons to Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, what did Trump do?
He declared an emergency about Iran so he could still sell weapons to Saudi Arabia.
Absolutely. So that is an excellent little summary. For those of you who debated on the immigration topic, you might remember the question about, there was a long period of time where it was like, is Trump going to declare a national emergency to build the wall? You all remember that?
Yep. Okay.
This is sort of analogous to that, which is that Congress had put a hold on a particular sale to Saudi Arabia. They were like, we don't like that. Menendez had put a hold on it. And this was a type of weapon system that Obama had originally started selling to Saudi Arabia, then he stopped. Then Trump wanted to reinstitute those sales. And Congress was like, let's put the brakes on here. We're not so sure about this. And Trump declared an emergency. He said, Iran is the emergency, okay? And as a result, we have to do this. I'm using my emergency powers to do this arms sale without congressional approval. So it took the question out of Congress's hands by declaring an emergency, which is something that is allowed to do in the law, but is not really a process that had been fully established before. And so this is something that is literally this is breaking news. If you pull it up, if you pull up the New York Times today, you're gonna see an article on top about Iran and the tankers, okay? And if you start reading about that, the subtext to that is very much related to an arms sale that Trump is working on, okay? So when we say this topic is something that is going on right now, I literally mean this morning there is new news about whether Iran was actually involved in this tanker question and what the evidence is for that, and that is being debated, and the subtext for that is also an arms sale. I saw a question over here somewhere.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I was a little confused about how a state of emergency in Iran could affect arms sales to Saudi Arabia.
That's a really good question. Okay, so when we get to the Saudi Arabia section in a second, I think when you look at the map, this will make it a little clearer. But we arms Saudi Arabia a lot, right? Number one, we've seen that. And a huge portion of the justification for that is our fears of Iran and Saudi Arabia's fears of Iran, okay? If you do a little bit of reading about like the Iranian Revolution and Saudi Arabia's relationship to Iran after that, the United States' relationship to it after that, you will discover that while the United States and Saudi Arabia may not be that aligned in a lot of other areas, okay? We have like totally different political systems, we have very different, justice and systems and rights, and they're just like very, very different countries. But the United States and Saudi Arabia are generally aligned on one thing, which is the need to prevent Iran from gaining more power. Saudi Arabia is very concerned about that because of their location. The United States is very concerned about that because of potential weapons that Iran would have, or the destabilizing effect that an aggressive Iran would have on the region. But the United States has been arming Saudi Arabia for more than a generation, and we've been doing that for the most part to stop Iran. And so when Trump wants to sell more arms to Saudi Arabia, the obvious reason for him is to say that there's a new Iranian threat. There's a new threat from Iran. And it is an open question, and honestly, like I think that more evidence is going to come out about this over the next week or so. Like I'm not totally sure what I have decided so far on like how much this threat is real versus how much this threat is like convenient, and like what is new. But it is that is the justification for that. Good question. The last piece of regulation, like the last existing regulation that I want to talk about briefly, is the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, known as ITAR, from 1976. And this is the implementing legislation for the AECA. So Arms Export Control Act has implementing legislation. And this is the document that spells out the list of things known as the U.S. Munitions List, or USML, that has the list of things that requires additional, that is an arms sale. It's like what defines what has to have additional scrutiny versus what you can just sell ordinarily. So the State Department determines a list of things with DoD input, Department of Defense input, and the items on that list cannot be exported without a license from the State Department. So the idea is that if you are trying to sell something to another country, you have to consult the list. If something is on the U.S. munitions list, then you need an export license. If it is not on the U.S. munitions list, then you don't need a license. This implements the AECA by regulating U.S. transfers of defense items. Yep.
So it's the Department of State that issues an export license.
Yep.
Okay.
All right. Next section. Oh, sorry.
Does the U.S. munitions list only apply to DCS sales then?
I think the list applies to both.
Okay.
I would have to confirm that. Okay. Costs and benefits of arms sales. So when we get into sort of like what we're going to be debating, so the things so far have given you background on sort of what the context for debates are, but it hasn't really told you, what's going to happen in round 3 of the tournament, right? And now we're getting into that. So we're going to look at the motivations for countries to buy and sell arms, which I think provides context for then advantages on the topic and disadvantages on the topic. And then we're going to finish up by talking about some major AFs on the topic. So why do countries sell arms? One thing that it's important to understand when you're looking at why countries sell arms is that when we're talking about selling arms from the United States or from most other countries, certainly capitalist countries, it's not the United States government that's producing the weapons, okay? It is a company in the United States that is producing the weapons. And I think that that's important to understand because it helps explain sort of why arms sales happen. It helps explain a bunch of the politics of it. It helps you understand, like, who are we talking about here? So when you look at the chart that's in the document of major arms dealers, or major arms producers, excuse me, and the major arms producers are not individual countries, they are companies, okay? So Lockheed Martin is the world's largest arms producer, okay? In 2017, it produced $45 billion with a B, dollars worth of arms, many of which were exported, okay? The second one is Boeing, also a United States company, and number 2. The third one is Raytheon. You're gonna start to probably know some of these words. The fourth one, we finally made it to a non-United States company, is BAE Systems out of the UK. But then the 5th and 6th are also from the United States. And so when you're looking at arms sales, you're not talking about things the United States government has produced. The United States government itself doesn't build weapons, okay? Companies build weapons on contracts from the United States and or to sell to other countries. And the reason that it's important to understand that is because when a company is building a weapons system, they would like to do so as efficiently as possible, and they would like to do so while making as much profit as possible. So when we're looking at why countries sell arms, the sort of first major reason is for economic and efficiency reasons, okay? The initial arms exports were to keep production going in times of domestic peace, right? So when the United States is not at war, these companies would still like to be producing weapons. And to a lesser degree, although also important, the United States would like them to still be producing weapons so that everything is like ready to go if we need some more stuff, right? We produce stuff for the United States every year, even if we're not, engaged in a conflict, although, in your lifetime we've been engaged in a conflict the whole time. But we produce way, way more than the United States needs at any given time. Because it is much more cost efficient to produce things consistently and on a large scale than it is to produce things on a small scale, right? It's like the difference between, a factory and like an Etsy shop. The factory it costs much less for the factory to produce a given object than it costs for the Etsy shop to produce a given object because they're producing it in an economy of scale. Make sense, sort of generally? Okay, so the other reason about economics and efficiency is that selling arms helps to offset the costs of creating those arms, the technological innovation that the military is getting. When they can sell more of those things, whatever the thing is, then they get more return on each investment. So the research and development costs that go into producing a given thing, the more you sell of that thing, the more those costs decrease per item, right? So the United States likes to, and other countries like to sell more things because it reduces the cost per thing for the United States to make it produce those things, and it keeps our companies going even in times where they're not necessarily producing things for the United States. The second major reason that countries sell arms is for power and security reasons. So it is because we would like to enhance our allies and counter our rivals. The degree to which that works, I think, depends a lot on which country we're talking about and at which time. But the sort of major justification is like we would like to help country X, we would like to make sure country Y does not get helped, and so the way we do that is we sell arms to country X. We are trying to avoid direct military intervention. Remember, we talked about that before, sort of back in the Nixon Doctrine during the Cold War, the proxy conflict idea. So instead of the United States having to get involved in a region, maybe we can just do an arms sale, and that will prevent the United States from having to get involved. And then the last power and security reason is about influence. So proponents of arms sales argue that selling arms increases influence over the buying country. So things like we can add conditions, things like strengthening our relationship with that country, strengthening interoperability. And so just sort of if we're selling to that country, then we have more influence over that country because they want the stuff. So they're more likely to go along with us. Empirically, this is a relatively weak effect. I think that most of the time countries we sell to do what is in their best interest at any particular time, or what they think is in their best interest at any particular time. And I think they're less interested in, what does the United States think about this than we would like them to be, or that the people in charge would like them to be. But that is sort of the other major reason countries sell arms. Why do they buy arms? Other countries buy arms. Why are they buying arms? 4 reasons. First is defense. They literally need them or think they need them against a rival. We're talking about preparing for a conflict, replenishing during a conflict, upgrading systems, rebuilding after a conflict. They need them for military reasons. The second is relationships. This is the flip side of what I just talked about. Buying countries also think sometimes that sales can generate a stronger relationship with a country that is more powerful than they are. So buying from the United States can be a way of currying favor with the United States, which has a stronger military than the country that is buying those weapons. So they are trying to establish that relationship. A third reason is technology transfer. So sometimes countries buy weapon systems because you can innovate faster when you have a model, and you get a lot of non-military technology spin-offs from weapon systems. So sometimes you will see a country buying things that they don't really need right then in a military sense. They don't need it against a rival right then. And sometimes they're doing that to deter a rival, but sometimes they're also doing that because there are ancillary benefits of having high technology and military systems. And then finally, the last reason is something called offsets. So offsets is a term in arms sales literature, and it means incentives that are added to the deal by the selling country to the buying country. And generally what it means is that if the arms manufacturer who's getting the deal agrees to invest in the buying country in some other capacity. So if, say, the United Arab Emirates is buying arms from the United States, as part of that deal, Boeing, if they're the ones who are in charge, are doing that deal, might agree to invest in the UAE. That is things like building infrastructure. That is things like putting manufacturing plants there. Sometimes it means co-producing the weapons, so we'll produce some of them in the UAE and some of them in the United States. But it's basically trying to sweeten the deal, okay? We want countries buying from us rather than buying from other people, and the way companies and countries deal with that is to provide offsets. One thing that's sort of interesting is that these types of deals are actually illegal under the WTO for everything other than military exchanges. Okay, so any other deal that involved this type of offset is illegal under WTO. It's considered an unfair trading practice because it's not part of the deal. It is literally just like buy from us, not them. It's almost like it's a low-level form of bribery. Okay, and that is illegal under the WTO, except for military systems, which are explicitly exempted under WTO laws from these types of deals. So these types of deals, which all, can involve direct payments to people in those countries, like direct payments to government officials. A direct payment to a government official, in other words, is known as a bribe, right? You were talking about bribing someone. Those are illegal in other contexts, but not in this context. All right, so the advantages of reducing arms sales. So advantages of reducing arms sales. One thing to note here, and I think it's an important thing to understand, is that while there are some universal themes, and in just a second I'm going to talk about some universal themes and advantages, a lot of the details of the advantages are country specific. So you are going to need to know something about Taiwan to debate Taiwan. You can't just know something about arms sales in general, right? And that's the thing that's cool about this topic, I think, is that you're going to learn a lot about individual parts of the world that maybe you don't know a ton about, or maybe you do, but you can learn more. There are some general themes which I'm going to talk about now. So the first is human rights-based advantages. So there are a lot of ways in which arms sales potentially or do violate human rights of people living in the countries that the weapons are being used on. So U.S. weapon systems have been and will continue to be used against civilians in conflict, and they have been and will continue to be used by governments cracking down on their own people. Okay, and U.S. weapons have and will continue to be used in situations that we would consider genocides or other major human rights violations. The country-by-country details differ, but this is a systematic problem throughout the history of arms sales, and that is something that it is challenging to prevent, for a reason we'll talk about in just a second. So, human rights advantages. As I said before, Trump officially elevated economic and commercial issues to the same level as human rights in our policy, which means when you have more things considered at the same level, that sort of reduces the amount to which each of the old things were considered, and so human rights has been less of an issue or less of a consideration in our arms sales than it has been in the past, and so that is definitely something that the affirmative can talk about. The second category of advantages are security-based advantages. And there are sort of three terms that I think you need to know to understand the ways in which an arms sale might reduce security. So reduce security and stability in the long term. The first is a term called blowback. Blowback, it's one word. Blowback is when the country that sells the weapons ultimately has their own weapons used against them, whether immediately or in the future. So I sold you something and then you used it against me. There are sort of three ways in which blowback happens. The first is that someone who is an ally, I'll let you a second, becomes an adversary. Okay, so someone who was our ally in one conflict becomes an adversary. Remember how I said before that weapons last a long time and these weapon systems last a long time? That's important to understand because when you sell to a country, you're sort of committing or you're assuming that things are going to sort of continue the way they are for quite a while, and that doesn't always happen. The second way is that someone who we just sold to for economic reasons, they did not have ton of geopolitical relevance at the time, becomes an adversary. So it's not someone who was an ally, like flipping sides, but it's an area of the world that we were not particularly interested in at a particular time, all of a sudden becomes much more relevant, maybe even 10 or 15 or 20 years down the future, and so our weapons get used against us. And then the final way our weapons get used against us is that weapons can be sold or stolen, right? Some of the things we're talking about are very big, but they move. And a lot of the things we're talking about are not so large that they couldn't disappear. So a lot of times what happens is that during a conflict, a number of weapons go missing, right? And whether that's intentional, like people are covertly selling them to make some money, or whether that's unintentional and they're just stolen, weapons go missing all the time, weapons systems go missing all the time, and then all of a sudden they're being used against the United States even though we sold them to someone else. There was a question over here. Yeah?
Would an example be like all the terrorist groups that we funded or armed?
Yes, they would. Yes, a very, very good example is that when we talk about like the United States creating ISIS or Al-Qaeda, that is like a literal term. In addition to like, it's not just talking about like United States policy has created situations where people are angry with us and then become terrorists. We are often talking literally that we have directly armed groups that then, a generation later we're fighting against. So we armed the Taliban and then fought against them, a generation later, with using our own weapons, and they still work. So yes, that is exactly how that happens. That's called blowback. The second term to understand for security-based advantages is something called entanglement. Entanglement. So we talked before about how one of the ideas of arms sales is that you sell arms so that you don't have to get involved in a conflict. Okay, like we sell arms instead of troops. But sometimes an arms sale does not decrease the likelihood that we send troops. It actually increases it. It's sort of what we call a slippery slope to U.S. intervention. We start doing arms sales, then all of a sudden we're invested in the conflict. Now, then we're selling troops. So that's one way entanglement happens. Another way entanglement happens is that arms sales do not have a neutral effect on the other countries that are in that area, right? If we sell arms to a particular country, their neighbors all of a sudden are like, ooh, why do they need so many weapons? I'm starting to get concerned. Maybe that country then buys from the United States or from another country. That's called an arms race, right? Everyone is racing to get more arms. But arms sales, instead of just deterring conflict, which is sort of what we would like to think that they do, or the people who are selling the arms would like to think they do, more weapons keeps people from attacking us. Arms sales can also exacerbate existing tensions because other countries then start to see the country that bought the arms as much more threatening than they did just a little bit before. And then finally, the third way entanglement happens, encouraging conflict rather than deterring it, is that arms sales can embolden regimes or coups within the country that bought the arms. And the reasons for that is either because they literally want the weapons, like there's more incentive to take over that government, or there have been some circumstances where countries think that they have the United States as backing, and so there's sort of more of an incentive for particular regimes to feel stronger because the United States sold arms to them. So a country that we sold arms to maybe defensively, all of a sudden starts using them in an aggressive or offensive way. Two things to know about weapons that we sell. One is that it is generally not as controversial to sell things that are strictly defensive in nature. So there are some weapon systems that some people think of as defensive in nature. Mostly we're talking about missile defense there, right? Things that allow you to repel an attack from somewhere else. An exception to areas of the world where missile defense might not be escalating is North Korea, South Korea. North Korea really does not want South Korea having missile defense, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But generally, it is not as destabilizing and not as likely to lead to the security-based problems if we are selling defensive weapons rather than offensive ones. A second thing to understand about the weapon systems that we're selling for the most part is that they are not as helpful in the war on terror as you might think that they are. For two reasons. The first is that a lot of times the things that we are selling are not the kinds of things that are needed against terrorist groups. Those are much more small arms, small-scale conflict, individual conflict. And then the second is that direct intervention and sales by the United States often increases motivations for terrorist groups rather than decreasing. It is not a war of deterrence, it is a motivation-based thing. And so if the United States is selling arms to groups that the terrorists then feel like they have more motivation to participate in. So it doesn't help with the war on terror as much as you would think. Disadvantages to arms sales. So I've broken down disadvantages, and obviously there's a lot of disadvantages on the topic, but I've broken down disadvantages into three categories. Economic and political disadvantages, security disadvantages, and a supplier shift category of disadvantages. I think it's important to sort of understand that argument a little bit separately. So, economics and political disadvantages. One disadvantage that you're going to have to debate this year is the defense industrial base DA. And this might have different names, but the argument here is that the defense industry, as I explained before, depends on arms sales to produce weapons, to produce other weapons, right? It uses the money that they get from selling things in order to build more things, economies of scale, efficiency, etc. So, when we reduce arms sales, if we did so in a very large way, that might reduce the ability of the United States to continue producing our own military technology at the same level. Lack of those deals also impacts things like government subsidies and research and development budgets. The impact of this disad is probably some sort of military power hegemony style argument. It's an argument about the United States has less military power because we are selling less stuff, it is less efficient, our defense industrial base will be doing worse, and that would be bad for us in a military capacity. The second disadvantage, which is very related, but it's sort of a different way of explaining this disadvantage, is a jobs disadvantage. So this is similar to the defense industrial base, right? When we sell less things, we need to build less things. That hurts the defense industrial base. But this version is focused on the individual people, the economic problems of cutting arms sales. So the defense industry employs a lot of people, and employs people in a bunch of different parts of the country. Remember we talked before about how they tried to spread out where they're producing things as much as possible. So that means that there are a lot of towns where the defense manufacturer is a very large part of the jobs in that town, especially high-skilled and specialized skilled jobs that pay pretty well. So the jobs DA is an economic DA that says if you cut arms sales, those factories have to close, and that hurts jobs, hurts the economy. So the impact of that disad is like an economic argument. The third category of jobs, or the third disadvantage under economics and political disadvantage, is the politics and elections disadvantage. And the reason I group these together is that the arguments are really similar. The political cost to eliminating arms sales is almost all focused on perceived reduction in benefits to particular districts or perceived reduction in jobs. Okay? So remember I said before that the American public doesn't love arms sales that much? They don't. But they do love jobs. And so when you're looking at the political cost of reducing arms sales, which the Act has to do, the political cost of having fewer arms sales, that political cost comes in a lot of different districts, and so thus leads to a lot of different Congress people being concerned. It is also really essential to understand that the defense industry is incredibly strong, and that their lobbying arm is very, very, very effective, and that there is also lots of lobbying corruption. So what I mean by that is a couple of things. I mean, literally sometimes defense industry companies buy off politicians. They're just like, we have a lot of money. You would like to be reelected. Let's make a deal, okay? And that is very strong in this industry. They also have a number of people in the media and people at think tanks that are directly funded by either countries that are buying weapons, like Saudi Arabia, or like Taiwan, South Korea, etc. So countries that are buying weapons sometimes have people at think tanks that they are sort of employing to be pro-arms sales, or buying off members of the United States media from companies in the United States to sort of keep them supporting arms sales. Another thing that's important to understand is that people go back and forth between the government and the defense industry all the time. So if you look at the bios of the people that are high up in our government, in the Department of Defense, sometimes in the State Department, certainly the people who are looking at approving these deals, many of them very recently worked for the very companies that are trying to get those deals. And how you feel about that, I think probably from my tone you can tell how I felt about that. But how you feel about that sort of depends on how you feel about unfettered capitalism, right? But it is important to understand that a lot of times it's like the very same people who negotiate a deal and then later are in the government working on, oh, should we have that deal? Oh, look at that. Coincidentally, it happens to benefit the company that I used to work for. So the public is generally against arms sales. They're not aligned with the government, which tends to be very pro-arms sales. But the government has successfully generally repackaged the sort of idea of arms sales as a jobs proposal. So it's not about arms sales to whatever country, it's about jobs. You like jobs, who doesn't like jobs? And now, in order to get the public on board. So when you're looking at politics in terms of a political capital DA, you're going to be talking about lobbying, you're going to be talking about who's on which side. If you're looking at politics in terms of an elections DA, there's not an elections DA in the opening packet, but pretty soon we're going to be talking about the 2020 election, if we're not already. That will be the conversation, is jobs versus arms sales, and what the media message is going to be to the public. The final disadvantage category, or disadvantage that's in this category, is separation of powers styles disadvantage. So this depends on what the plan does, but a lot of arms sales acts impact the relationship between Congress and the executive. Remember, we talked about under the Arms Export Control Act, Congress has said, executive, you get to be in charge of negotiating these arms sales. We can veto, but we don't have to approve them. That could change, right? Part of the affirmative could change that relationship. So an act that increases congressional control over arms sales, which is something that is proposed a lot in literature, would have a disadvantage to that. That says reduction in executive power is bad, probably because of war fighting, terrorism. You want the executive to have as much control as possible for military reasons. On the flip side, an act that increases independent executive action could have a disad to that based on having an executive that has too much power is bad. That one's harder to win because the uniqueness is very much in favor of the executive right now, but theoretically is something that could be related. All right, security disadvantages. So, security disadvantages, first one is a relations disadvantage. This means that, and this is a disadvantage, and category is like ending the arms sale angers the country that we used to be selling to and are now not selling to anymore or have reduced our selling to. It is a major blow to relations to stop selling to a country. In the literature, you will see this referred to as an access argument. An access argument that arms sales buy access. It buys information, it buys assistance, it buys U.S. training. The arms sales buys access to the United States. And so when we eliminate or reduce an arms sale with a particular country, that reduces the access of that country, and they probably don't like that. And the impacts of this disad are either the problem of weakening that country, so the country that we stop selling to is weaker, they can't fight wars or they can't deter other things in their region, or external, that we have decided to sell to a country because we think that they are strategic for a different region, usually in the war on terror, and so reducing relations with that country might mean that they're no longer that interested in helping us in the war on terror. The second category of disadvantages I've called allies disadvantages. If you are looking at the opening packet later today with your lab or on your own, this category is what the assurances disadvantage falls under. There's a disadvantage called assurances, and I consider that an allies disadvantage. What I mean by that is that cutting off arms sales can also have effects on other allies. So not the country that is involved in the sale, but other countries, maybe in that region, maybe not in that region, who see that the reduction in arms sales as a signal of our lack of interest in becoming involved in conflicts that might affect them too. So, in the Taiwan affirmative, the assurances disadvantage, so the affirmative says reduce arms sales to Taiwan. The assurances disadvantage says other countries that we also have alliances with in that region and globally, like Japan and South Korea, would see our reduction in arms sales to Taiwan as like a really bad sign about whether we're going to defend them and continue to support them, okay? So it is not about relations with the country that we're stopping the sale to, it is about relations with other countries that are our allies. The impact of that is usually proliferation, so those countries start to produce just start to decide that the United States no longer has their back, and it's going to start producing their own weapons, and that's sort of the allies category of disad. And then the last category under security disadvantages is what we're calling enemies disadvantages. Enemies disadvantages. The deterrence disadvantage in the introductory packet is this kind of disadvantage. Arms sales can signal U.S. resolve to protect a given region, right? Remember we talked about how it's like we're helping our allies, ideally deterring rivals. When we stop doing those arms sales, that can signal to adversaries that they can be aggressive without penalty, that the United States is no longer in it to care that much about that region. That if we eliminated arms sales to a particular area or a particular country, other adversarial powers in that area will see that as a signal of U.S. lack of intervention in that area. The impact to that disadvantage is generally war with the aggressive country. Now, you might say to yourself, these are very similar, right? Like the allies and the enemies, it's like really just two sides of the same coin. It's like if we stop supporting a particular country, that country and its neighbors might get nervous, and also countries that might be adversarial toward that country, gets a little bit excited. And so those are just sort of the two sides of the same coin of like, if we stop supporting a particular country, it has impacts on the countries around it. The last category of disadvantages, we're going to call supplier shift or market share DAs. Some people use a debate term called fill-in. So if you hear somebody talking about fill-in, that's what they mean. But it's not really a term that's used in the literature. Most of the time in the literature, they call these supplier shift DAs or I don't use the word DAs, obviously. Supplier shift arguments or market share arguments. And you're going to have a lecture on this later in the week. But this is a category of disadvantage that is also a case turn. And what the thesis of this disadvantage is it says we should sell to a particular country because if we don't sell to them, they'll buy elsewhere. Okay? So it's like better us than them. Better us than someone else. This is not that different than like the parents who give their kids alcohol because the kids are going to get alcohol somewhere, and so might as well be in our house. Okay, that's the thesis of this disadvantage. Okay, and the idea is that if we stop selling, other countries like Russia and China might start selling to that country, and we'd rather have them get them here. Yeah.
So this kind of like, it sounds similar to the Allies view, where it's like an alternative. If like we stop selling to them, they might like, if you do an Allies where they look elsewhere, so it's like a combination of both.
Yeah, it's similar to that. I think part of sort of the thesis of this DA is that the countries that they would start buying from are worse than the United States providing them. So there's a case turn element to this. If they have a human rights advantage, for example, the part of this disadvantage that's a case turn argues that Russia or China or whoever they'd start buying from does not care very much at all about the human rights consideration. So even if the United States isn't like doing a great job of caring about human rights in this conflict, the country that they'd start buying from is worse. And stopping buying from the United States removes the United States' leverage, right? The idea of, the United States believes that selling arms to a particular country gives us leverage. If we stop selling to them, they buy from somewhere else. Now we no longer have the ability to, set constraints on the sale, only sell particular things, change, set limitations on how those weapons are used. Yes?
So, is there any literature that says that some country other than Russia and China will fill in, or?
Yes, Europe.
Yeah.
UK, Germany, France, they sell a lot, so yes. Generally, if you're reading the dissent, you probably want to say that they buy from someone who's more adversarial to us than, they're just going to start buying from BAE Systems or something in the UK. But yes, there's definitely stuff that says there are other countries. There are sort of two impacts to this. One is a competitiveness impact, that it would hurt U.S. competitiveness and market share and leadership not to be the ones selling. So it hurts our defense industry for no reason because there's a uniqueness component to this that says there's going to get them somewhere, so they might as well get them from us and help our defense industry than someone else's. There's also a proliferation element to this, that United States sales come with strings, and so maybe other countries don't come with strings, and it's better to have the strings than not the strings for other anti-proliferation things. I want to put a big asterisk here. So if this is a good disadvantage, then the affirmative would need a reason that it's bad for the United States to sell arms, not just why arms sales in general are bad, right? Like why it has to come from the United States. If I were using debate terms, I would say that a U.S. key warranted. Okay, but the big asterisk that I think it's really important to understand is that the things that they are buying, it is not just like a one-to-one swap. So they can stop buying tanks from the United States this year, and next year they have Russian tanks, no biggie. We're just gonna continue, Saudi Arabia just continues fighting in Yemen, which is different aircraft, okay? Or different, somebody else is in air refueling them or whatever, okay? The shift from buying from one country to buying from another country is an enormous shift and will require a ton of time and a ton of resources. Okay, it is not a small thing. When I was thinking about arms sales, I was thinking about I was initially thinking about it in the category of guns, right? Where it's I get a gun from this person, or you could get it military weapons from another country, just swap them out. It does not work like that. Okay, we're talking about things like helicopters. Okay, we're talking about things like tanks. We're talking about things like missile defense systems. And there are two important things to understand. One is that the United States' stuff that we sell is dramatically better than what other countries are selling. So it's not necessarily that Russia and China don't have good military tech, but it is mostly the case that they're not selling their best stuff, and even their best stuff is not nearly as good as the United States is, especially in the context of air power. So our fighter jets, greater than anyone else's fighter jets in the context of abilities to do things like fighting the current war in Yemen, bombing civilians. The United States, if the United States got out of the game of selling fighter jets, it would be a very big thing, not a small thing. Okay. The second thing to understand is it's sort of like saying that if all the Middle East just stopped selling oil, we could just no big deal. We could just start driving solar cars. It's yes. Your grandkids might be driving solar cars if there's no more oil, okay? That might happen. But it's not just you can go out and buy a solar car today and everyone just auto has solar cars, right? There is a huge amount of resources and time that has to be expended in getting everything switched over. It is not an immediate switch. So when we're talking about a supplier shift or a market share DA or fill in, It's not as simple as like I think it might intuitively sound. And so when you're reading about that, I think that's something to sort of keep in mind. There was a question over here somewhere. Yeah.
So, are there any answers to this? It takes a lot of time to shift.
No, I think it just takes a lot of time to shift. The neg would have to say, you know, I mean, the neg's argument is, and this is why it's maybe more useful as like a case turn, is like they would shift and it would take some time and it would take some resources, but like that would still be worse than the United States continuing to sell and we want their influence. So, like no, it just, I mean, for particular weapons, I mean, it sort of depends on what they're buying. If it's small arms, like maybe, then it's not as much. But if we're talking like major weapon systems, no, it really just does take a lot of time. Yeah.
Oh, I was just gonna say also, like, isn't it like a lot of like these big systems like communicate with each other?
Yes, they all have to be able to, remember we talked about that word interoperability before? If you just get a bunch of weapon systems from one country and then get a bunch of other ones from another country, they don't talk to each other. Yes, absolutely. Yes?
So kind of along that line, do countries tend to only buy from one singular country as a whole, or is it kind of pick and choose?
It depends on the purpose and what they're buying. I think there are countries that buy different categories of things from different people, or they're using them in different areas or for different uses. But for the most part, you're trying to, if you're getting fighter jets, you want all your fighter jets from the United States or whatever. Yeah. Also, the metric system turns out to be like a sort of hilariously complicating factor here, which is like the United States' weapons all operate on like inches and stuff, and the metric system, which like, yeah, sure, metric. Yeah. Yeah.
So more of the kind of like power quality of like arms are much better than other nations.
Yep.
Don't other nations still like steal technology from the United States to reverse engineer it in order to like?
They do. Yeah, they absolutely do. The time frame of that is also like relatively slow. So when you're against this kind of disadvantage, you're really just you're talking about extending the time frame, right? It is one war that doesn't get fought because they don't have arms sales. Maybe that might be enough of an advantage. It is also a reason, by the way, that I think it is beneficial to affirmatives to read the large acts, like the large countries that are buying lots of stuff, rather than a small country that only buys a little bit of stuff. Because a country that's only buying a small amount, it's like, oh, we're so tricky. Like they won't have an egg to, whatever. They don't have their Azerbaijan egg. It's like, okay, they probably do. And the amount that they're buying, when the amount that you're buying is really small, then these disadvantages make more sense because there's like less to transfer over. A country that buys a lot, it's a lot to transfer slow. Yep.
You said earlier that a lot of the weapons the US sells like last long periods of time.
Yep.
So would like the long-lasting ability of US weapons be able to overcome some of these sort of like time frame deficits?
I mean, it might hurt the ability of the app to solve immediately. All of those things require like constant reinfusions of like artillery and that sort of thing, though. It's like the tank still works, but maybe they don't have the artillery to put in the tank. And so that's why the arms sales tend to be like over a long period of time. All right, let's talk about types of apps. So I divided apps into two categories. Category number one is what I'm calling top-level process affirmatives. Top-level process affirmative. A top-level process affirmative changes the way arms sales are conducted in general rather than focusing on a specific country. So it's not stop selling arms to Taiwan, stop selling arms to South Korea, stop selling arms to the UAE. It is change the way arms sales are conducted. Some apps that fall into this category are the thing I described before, increasing congressional control over the sales. One thing you could do is just switch it to Congress has to affirm a sale rather than reject a sale. That would dramatically reduce the number of sales because, as you know, it's hard to get Congress to agree to do anything. And so if they had to positively affirm a sale rather than just vetoing the sale, it's like a very different amount of political will that would be required, and so that might just be useful. Or they could amend the Arms Export Control Act to take more congressional control over the whole process. Another thing that you could do as a top-level process app is to add more human rights restrictions to the process of determining an arms sale. So a whole category of apps is just like, we care about a lot of things more than we care about human rights in terms of how these things are being used. We could care about human rights a lot more. A top-level process app says care about human rights a lot more. A related but different app could eliminate a particular type of weapon. So, for example, cluster bombs, very, very dangerous for civilians. It's something you could eliminate, or eliminate a particular weapon or weapon system from selling to any country. And then the affirmative is less focused on the individual country where we're selling to, and more on why a particular weapon system is not great. Another F in this category would be to eliminate direct commercial sales. So make all sales have to be foreign military sales. Require them all to be government to government instead of direct commercial sales. This one is interesting because I think it would pretty substantially reduce arms sales, but would also it might actually in some ways turn some of the arguments that it could also increase arms sales, and it could turn some of the arguments about the defense industrial base or whether they, that might be actually better for them. But eliminating direct commercial sales is a possibility for an act. Because remember, the topic says and or, so if you reduce one, even if the other one increases, you would have met the burden to reduce that one thing. And then the last one I put in this category is to ratify the Arms Trade Treaty. So the Arms Trade Treaty is an international treaty that was actually negotiated in the United States, and the United States signed it under the Obama administration, but we haven't ratified it. Congress did not get together to ratify it. And then in April, Trump came along and unsigned the treaty. So the Arms Trade Treaty, it's not super powerful. Okay, it does not eliminate arms sales in a hugely meaningful way, but it does increase transparency. It does require arms sales to meet a higher burden than they do now, and it does sort of establish some international norms for what arms sales should look like. But the United States is now not a party to that treaty, so signing and ratifying the Arms Trade Treaty is something that I think would probably be topical, though, maybe. The second major category of AFs is country-based affirmatives. Country-based affirmatives. And I have sort of divided those into sort of three categories of countries that we sell arms to. Category number one is our allies. Okay, so we sell arms to the UK. They're a very strong ally. We sell arms to Australia. They're a strong ally. We sell arms to Japan and South Korea. Allies. Okay? That category, those categories of AF exist, but it is a country that we currently have a strong relationship with. The second category of country-based affirmatives are what I'm calling strategic partners. And these are mostly countries that we've gotten involved with since 9/11, that we sell arms to strategically, but maybe we're not aligned in other elements of our foreign policy. So we think it's very useful for a particular country to have weapons so that we can fight alongside them in the war on terror, but we're not politically aligned with them on most other foreign policy issues. And then the third category that I've established is sort of neutral countries and adversaries. This is the category where we mostly sell to for economic reasons, countries that we're just not that involved with at all, and or countries that maybe we actually disagree with. They're low-level adversaries that we sell to for economic reasons, and we're pretty convinced most of the time that we're not going to end up in a war, or the things that we're selling them are low level enough that we're not concerned that we're going to have to fight against those things. Whether we're right or not about that is remains to be seen. But those are sort of the three categories. So looking at specific countries, the first one I've included is Taiwan. This is the opening packet affirmative. So if you look at a map of Taiwan, you will see that's in there. There's a map. You will see that it is off the southeastern coast of China. For those of you who debated on the China topic, you probably know quite a bit about the China-Taiwan relationship. But Taiwan used to be a part of China. It is no longer a part of China according to Taiwan. It is a part of China according to China, the sort of one China policy. And the United States sells arms to Taiwan in order to deter China from taking Taiwan back over. Okay, so our thought is we would like Taiwan to stay independent, although we officially don't recognize them, or we play the do we recognize them, don't we recognize them game. But the United States sells a lot of arms to Taiwan, generally to deter China, and China sees eliminating U.S. arms sales as a precondition to any negotiations with Taiwan. So they think that the United States weapons are what's preventing Taiwan from reunifying with China. They see any negotiations over the status of China to the United States has to stop selling arms before China is willing to negotiate over Taiwan. I saw some questions.
What does that sit with our U.S. recognizes Taiwan as separate?
Yeah. So you all probably don't remember this unless you happen to debate on the China topic. But Trump, right after he got elected, called the president of Taiwan, and that was a really big deal at the time because we don't do that. We negotiate through intermediaries. There's all sorts of smoke and mirrors about what we do vis-a-vis Taiwan and vis-a-vis China to keep everybody from fighting. And it's a very unstable relationship, right? And so the affirmative that has been written for you all and that you'll be looking at later today or maybe tomorrow has been written that says United States arms sales have a destabilizing effect on the region. They're not stabilizing the region, they're destabilizing the region. And instead, we need to eliminate particular types of arms sales in order to reduce the likelihood that we fight a U.S.-China war, which seems like it would be pretty bad, and also reduce the likelihood of other conflicts in that area. If you look at the graph, you will see that we sold a lot of arms to Taiwan under Bush and Obama, and we've sold less under Trump. But there are, recent arms sales to Taiwan. Trump has reinvigorated U.S. arms sales to Taiwan, including some in 2019, and it clearly is going to continue selling arms to Taiwan, perhaps in an increased capacity. And so that is something that the affirmative says maybe is a bad idea, and the negative is going to say, wait, no, it's totally fine. Yeah?
What happened in the years where they just didn't sell anything?
Probably didn't need anything. So like the thing to understand about weapons, like a giant arms sale, they don't, like if there is an arms sale in 2011, like if you're looking at the graph, you'll see 2011 we sold almost 6 billion arms sales to Taiwan, and then 2012 and 2013 and 2014 we really didn't sell anything. It's not that they're not getting stuff from the United States in those years. The arms sale occurred, like the deal was made in a particular year, and then it gets like doled out over time. And then they have the stuff. Yeah.
Does China condition negotiations on like a complete reduction or like a complete elimination of arms sales?
It depends on who you ask. I think they would probably say yes.
Yeah. So like, then how does that interact with the Trump debate in terms of reduction? Does that just become a question of reduce?
Reduce. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like it would be hard to win T, like reduce to zero is not a reduction.
Yeah.
So I feel like if the F wants to, they could eliminate arms sales. I'm not sure they want to.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a I think you can reduce to zero. Yeah.
Is the United States the only country that sells to Taiwan, or do other countries also sell to Taiwan?
I think there are other countries that also sell to Taiwan, but they get the vast majority of their stuff from the United States. Yep.
Since we don't officially recognize Taiwan as independent, how do we refer to Taiwan in policy? Like as a Republic of China or?
I mean, like if you're just chatting, you probably say Taiwan, but in the plan, you probably say like Republic of China. Other? Yeah.
Do these sales mostly go through DCS or FMS?
I don't know that actually. I think we've done both to Taiwan, but I don't know like which particular sales are which.
FMS wouldn't make sense because then we'd be like
Acknowledging their military, yeah.
Can we do FMS sales to Taiwan? Is that legal?
I don't know. I'd have to look that up.
Like that?
Yep.
What is Taiwan's relationship to other like U.S. allies in the region, like Japan and South Korea?
So they also like deterring China, and so they are like pretty much happy with the United States selling to Taiwan because it deters China and also shows U.S. commitment to allies in the region. I think that they, would be a little nervous. Some people would say a lot nervous if the United States stopped selling arms to Taiwan, but it would, there's a question about how destabilizing it would be. Especially if we keep selling to those countries individually, like we're still selling, stuff to South Korea. Is South Korea like that concerned about Taiwan? I don't know. I don't think they'd love it. But the ask's going to say it's not that big of a deal. All right, second country we're going to look at is Saudi Arabia. And if you look at the map of Saudi Arabia, remember this is the country we sell the most weapons to. If you look at the map of Saudi Arabia, I think it helps explain the Iran question from before. Saudi Arabia and Iran right next to each other across the Persian Gulf. And we have had a long history of selling to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to deter Iran. They are currently using the weapons that we are selling them in their conflict in Yemen, which has involved many human rights abuses. Again, if you're looking at the map, you got like Saudi Arabia, and then you have Yemen down here, okay? And there are U.S. weapons have been used in killing civilians, so have lots of European weapons. There have been lots of exposés where you see a bomb and then you can see the serial number on it and trace like who sold those weapons. Germany, France, UK, United States have sold weapons to Saudi Arabia that are being used against civilians. As an official practice, this almost certainly violates the Arms Export Control Act because the use is not necessary or proportional in Yemen, but we keep selling them anyway. It potentially violates the human rights standards in some of our presidential decision directives on arms sales, but again, keep selling. The U.S. argues if we didn't sell to them, they'd buy from China or Russia and we'd lose our influence. Whether that's the case is a very open question. I think the app has a pretty strong argument that they would not. The EU passed a non-binding resolution that was like, ooh, maybe we should stop selling to Saudi Arabia or like take a break while they're doing this thing in Yemen, but it was non-binding. The only country that's really eliminated sales is Germany, which was another major supplier, and they have eliminated sales. But as we talked about before about the national emergency, Trump just declared a national emergency about Iran and Iranian aggression, bypassed Congress to immediately sell $8 billion of arms to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. The most controversial part of this is the precision-guided munitions, and I mentioned before that Obama was originally selling these. Then he stopped doing so. Trump wanted to sell them, Congress blocked it, and then Trump has declared a national emergency to do sort of an end run around Congress to prevent them from blocking the deal. If you look at the graph, and then I'll take the question, if you look at the graph, and I'm just going to turn this around because it's so large. This is United States arms sales to Saudi Arabia. Okay, the number is going up, and it is going up relatively dramatically. And so, part of the reason that they want to buy so many weapons right now is because they are engaged in a conflict in Yemen. And whether it is justified for the United States to be selling arms to a country that is participating in that conflict is something that you get to debate. But I think the AF has a very strong argument there. Yeah.
What was the impact of like Germany halting sales to Saudi Arabia, and like did that have any like economic implications?
For Germany, maybe not like global economic implications. They're still buying from the United States. The United States is selling more than we have before. So I think in that case, like because they were buying from multiple countries, Germany eliminating them does mean they don't get German weapons. But the United States is like overwhelmingly their largest supplier. So if the United States stopped selling to Saudi Arabia, I think there's a pretty good chance other countries would like follow along. But while the United States is selling to Saudi Arabia, all those other countries, with the exception of Germany, can have a very strong excuse that's just like, well, the United States is doing it, and they're the biggest supplier, so we might as well get the economic benefits from it.
Oh, I actually meant like from like Germany's standpoint, was there any impact on like their economy specifically, and how would that like, would you be able to argue that we can bring that?
Okay, I don't know. I mean, I assume it did. Germany does arms sales to other countries too. I'm not sure how much it hurt the German defense industrial base. I haven't researched that question, but it's sort of something they've already done and probably is not impacted by the plan because they stopped doing those sales. Yeah.
I mean, since they're selling to Saudi Arabia because of Iran, how come they can't just give weapons to Yemen because of Saudi Arabia?
That's a good question. And we have done arms sales to Yemen in the past. Part of the problem in Yemen right now, and you'll learn more about this when you start reading about it, is that there are some elements of internal conflict supported by Saudi Arabia, and there's a question of government coup rebels against the government. So like who we arm is a little bit difficult. I also think that it would be very challenging for our relationship with Saudi Arabia to like come in on the other side of the Yemen war, if that makes sense. And that is also sort of nominally the side that Iran is on. So Iran is also sort of involved in a proxy way in supporting one side of the conflict in Yemen, and so that would be that probably seems like something would be unlikely to do in a large capacity. In terms of like giving them, I don't know, missile defense or something. I mean, I would like it if we did, but it doesn't. I don't think that's very likely. Yep.
What's the U.S. incentive for arms sales to Saudi Arabia? Like, is it like relations or like the war on terror?
Yeah, both of those things. We see them as an essential ally against Iran, and so it is very important to us. Geopolitically, at least according to the people who want to sell arms, right? That's like a particular perspective I'm saying here, not like a universal standard. But from the perspective of people who want to sell arms to Saudi Arabia, they see it as necessary to deter Iran. Yep, and we need an ally in the region. Sorry.
Speaking of it, do you happen to know if we sell arms to Oman?
We do, right? I think we do. Yeah, we definitely do. Yeah. All right. Next country is South Korea. South Korea, we sell arms to. It is one of our top exports. But arms sales to South Korea, from the perspective of the affirmative, reducing those arms sales might help negotiations with North Korea. The sort of question on whether we sell arms to South Korea depends a lot on what you think about the likelihood of good faith negotiations with North Korea. If you think negotiations with North Korea are potentially possible, or a reduction in that conflict is possible, then stopping arms sales might be a precondition to doing that. You know, North Korea is not going to negotiate with large amounts of weapons in South Korea. They are also extremely concerned about the United States giving them missile defense and how good the missile defense we give them is, because that would eliminate North Korea's ability to first strike. So if South Korea has a missile defense that would eliminate a North Korean first strike, North Korea is like very, very, very concerned about that. It also might decrease Chinese aggression and fears if the United States decreased weapons sales to South Korea. The flip side of that is all the same disadvantages we talked about for Taiwan, right? That other allies get very concerned about that. They might increase the likelihood that North Korea just thinks it's worth it to invade South Korea or attack South Korea, etc. Another country that's worth talking about briefly is Israel. A lot of these, you know, it's like U.S. weapons are used in Israel both as a deterrent effect and as you know, to provide us an ally in that region. It's maybe our strongest ally in the region. However, you know, U.S. weapons are also used in human rights situations against, you know, Palestinians, and people are concerned about that. And arms sales to Israel might destroy our ability to have stronger relations with Muslim countries in that area. So they sort of see that as a red line, and U.S. arms sales to Israel definitely have an effect our ability to have relationships with other countries in that area. Potentially reducing arms sales to Israel might force some negotiations over something like a two-state solution. There are certainly people who think that it would de-escalate conflicts in Syria and Iraq if we reduced our arms sales to Israel. That is obviously extremely politically controversial and is you know, something that is worth researching. The last country I want to just mention briefly is Ukraine. Ukraine is right there on the Russian border, and it might antagonize Russia to sell to Ukraine, and that might be a reason that it's worth rethinking our arms sales to Ukraine. Maybe we don't want to antagonize Russia. They see United States arms sales to Ukraine as sort of like an intervention in their backyard. We would not be thrilled if anyone was selling a bunch of arms to like Mexico that they were using to deter us, right? So I think that is something that I've seen proposed. I'm going to give about 2 minutes for like top level questions, and then we're just going to like hit the topic reset button and talk about the guest lecturer who's coming right after this. So, quick questions. Sam.
Can you sell intellectual property count as an arms sale? Or is it all weapons?
Is it like the weapons intellectual property?
Like a design of like an artillery system?
I don't know. I think yeah.
We almost
It's
never
on
do
the
that.
export list, right? But we don't do it. Yeah.
Yeah, we don't do that.
Yeah. We don't really want them having the ability to do that. Maybe like some of the co-production stuff I talked about earlier. That's like we like co-produce it in a country, but we're not like giving them the blueprints for the most part. Yeah.
So under like foreign military sales, they also give grants to other nations to buy from the U.S. like foreign military funding.
If it is direct funding to their military and not like selling them a particular system, I think that's just like foreign aid or military aid, not a foreign military sale.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So we have like didn't like Trump and say like AFNS funding for like certain nations?
I'm sorry, there's a noise up here. Can you say it again?
Didn't like Trump and state like this like foreign military funding program for nations to like buy from U.S. companies? Was that kind of an arms deal then?
Yeah, I think if it's for arms. Yeah. Yeah.
Wouldn't SCS have like be okay, or any ops that doesn't necessarily narrow it down to one country?
Yeah, no, you could definitely mix and match. There are like a lot of the Saudi Arabia proposals also talk about the UAE. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, there's no reason it has to be categorized that way. It's just like often because the deal is to a particular country, when you're talking about which deals would be eliminated, you're often talking about countries, but you could eliminate multiple, for sure. Yeah.
Does the U.S. sell like intelligence data through like FMS and PCS?
Like actual intelligence or like the tech that collects the intelligence?
Either or, I guess.
I don't think that it's topical to eliminate just like intelligence sharing. That's not part of a. Yeah.
You mentioned stuff like in-air refueling. Does like continuation of like maintenance on already sold arms count? Like, do you see that's right?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Sometimes, like, part of the arms deal sometimes includes like going forward stuff to maintain that. So I think that would probably be included. For like in-air refueling, particularly, that's like a joint military operation as much as it's not really a sale. So I think that would probably not be topical. But it would be interesting if you could make it topical, because that's how a lot of the war in Yemen is fought, is that our fighters come in and like refuel them so they can go farther into Yemen. Yeah.
How would the reduction of arms sales to Israel lead to necessity for two-state solution?
Yeah, it's just more like Israel does not feel the need to negotiate on some of these issues because of strong United States support. a reduction in that support might increase their incentive to negotiate. That's obviously like a controversial statement. It's a debatable question, but yeah, that's the thesis.
Does the arms sale have to be monetary? So like could a trade of weapons between two countries count as a sale?
I think no, and I don't. Do we do that?
I don't know.
I don't know. I don't think so. No, I don't think that's not under. Yeah, no. Any other ones? All right, we're gonna hit the camera off button.